Hello and welcome to this segment of psychoeducation. My name is Judith Epereje and I will be taking you through executive functioning. So let's get started. So executive functioning are those high-order cognitive processes that allow people to be able to regulate their behavior, their thoughts, as well as their emotions. By cognitive, we mean everything and anything that have to do with the brain. Yeah, so executive functioning is basically the brain's managing system. So it coordinates all activities that one's brain power is supposed to accomplish. But it also allows people to be able to retain information as well as work with that information that is stored in their minds. And it allows people to filter distractions, so being able to focus on what you're doing without getting distracted with other things, but also switch from one topic or one project to another. So executive functioning is basically primarily associated with the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC as we normally call it. So the PFC starts developing from childhood but continues into early adulthood. And remember, the brain fully matures at around 25 years, 26 years of age or thereabout. So the brain develops from back to the front. And since the prefrontal cortex is located at the frontal lobe, so somewhere around your forehead, that means it's basically the last part of the brain to develop. So different parts of the PFC handle specific tasks when it comes to executive functioning. But the PFC does not work in isolation, but is connected with other brain structures like the basal ganglia and the thalamus. So this is just a mapping of the prefrontal cortex, or the brain's managing system, which is also the command center. So we have three different parts. The first one being the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that majorly handles called executive functioning skills, which I shall break down a bit in the next slide. We also have the orbitofrontal cortex, or the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that handles the hot executive functioning skills. We also have the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the interface that bridges the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex with the orbitofrontal or ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Yeah. So the called executive functions are purely based on logic or based on thoughts or purely just cognitive, and are detached from anything to do with emotions or social pressure. So they're called cool because they're detached from the heat of emotions. So key skills that make the called executive functions include the working memory. So this is a person's ability to be able to hold information in their head. Yeah, like being able to memorize a phone number, or even knowing the direction to your office or the direction to your house. We also have planning. So are you able to organize perhaps a schedule, or even come up with a grocery list, or even like a meal timetable at home? We also have inhibition. So are you able to focus on whatever you're doing without getting distracted by noise that could be coming from the environment? Yeah. The hot executive functions, on the other hand, involve the same thought processes but are used in those situations that are emotionally charged or require a reward or a consequence at the end. So these situations require the regulation of hot emotions like fear, desire, or excitement. And this is connected to the brain region that is known as the limbic or the emotional system. So the key skills that make up the hot executive functions include delayed gratification. So this is basically someone's ability to be able to hold off a small reward now for a bigger one later. Another one is emotional regulation. So are you able to regulate your emotions? Say perhaps when you lose a football match, are you able to regulate perhaps disappointment or anger? Or if you win a football match, are you able to regulate the excitement or the joy that you feel in that moment. We also have social decision making, and this is one's ability to be able to consider like what the other person would feel if they maybe use hurtful words. Yeah, so being able to empathize with the other person and then holding off something that could be hurtful to the other person. Yeah. We have at least 11 executive functioning skills that are divided into two panels, the thinking and the doing. So the thinking panel is made up of working memory, planning, organization, time management, as well as metacognition, which is one's ability to monitor their own task performance and perhaps catching a mistake before someone else does. The doing panel, on the other hand, is made up of response inhibition, emotional control, sustained attention, initiating tasks, goal-directed persistence, which is someone's ability to be able to complete a task, like from start to finish, regardless of the challenges that they might face. Like, are they able to keep at it? Yeah. And then flexibility. So flexibility, perhaps in terms of thoughts, perhaps in terms of shifting from one task to another, from one conversation to another. So why are executive functioning skills important? So they basically help promote positive behavior in people. They allow people to make healthy choices and promote independence in children. It is important to note that people are not born with executive functioning skills, but this is something that is learned. And this is a slow and progressive process. Remember, initially I mentioned that it starts developing, like executive functioning skills start developing from childhood and progress into early adulthood. Children build these executive functioning skills by engaging in different activities as well as interacting in social contexts. But those children who have deficient executive functioning skills are not done for, since these skills can be taught and improved. But it requires a lot of patience and work in the place of caregivers, who could be parents, teachers, house helps, and other relatives. So weak executive functioning skills can occur both in children that present with developmental disabilities and those that do not. So executive functioning dysfunction is not a diagnosis, but it's viewed on a spectrum. And it presents as difficulties in managing day-to-day activities. It presents as educational challenges, as well as difficulties in social contexts. Executive functioning dysfunction, however, manifests mostly on persons diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, cancer patients who are on chemotherapeutic agents, those individuals with learning disabilities, as well as those with mood disorders. And it has been proved that it has a greater impact on children with developmental disabilities than those without. Clinically, executive functioning dysfunctions present in persons diagnosed with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And it appears that the primary deficit here is in inhibitory control and in the working memory. So behaviorally, we see a lot of manifestation in terms of impulsivity. So always being on impulse, or acting on impulse. And then also high reaction time variability. So this is the moment-to-moment change in how an individual responds during cognitive or other motor tasks. It also occurs or presents in persons diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and the primary deficit here is in cognitive flexibility. So behaviorally, we see a lot of rigidity in terms of even changing from one topic to another or one conversation to another. Yeah, so that inability to shift sets or adapt to change. And in traumatic brain injury, we see that the primary disability or deficit is in acquired global dysfunction. And it is acquired global dysfunction because this person was not born with the dysfunction, but it happened out of a traumatic event. And behaviorally, it could present as secondary ADHD. And we find that people struggle with poor self-monitoring, and they also struggle with initiating conversations. So they're just low in terms of initiating things. Children presenting with executive function deficits may struggle with time management, so planning their activities or even keeping track of time. They might also show challenges with multitasking, analyzing ideas, or even learning from past experiences and invoking or utilizing those learnings in new experiences or current experiences, and then allowing that to guide them in how they proceed or how they do something differently, or even just repeating things that worked in a past experience. They might also show challenges with analyzing tasks or even breaking those tasks into smaller chewable bites. So remember we said that executive functioning skills start developing from childhood and progresses into early adulthood. So by around 3 to 4 years, a child should be able to stop unsafe behavior. They should be able to help at home with those tasks that involve or require just one step. So maybe taking their plate to the kitchen after eating. So by age 5 to 7, they need to progress into doing 2 to 3 step tasks. They should be able to do at least simple chores like perhaps wash some utensils with a bit of help. They should be able to organize their space, and their focus should progress to at least 20 to 30 minutes. When they get to 8 to 11 years, children are supposed to be able to remember tasks that they're given. They should be able to do independent work for at least 60 minutes or less. They should be able to track where they keep their belonging, and they should be able to wait in turn. So if maybe they're going to the washroom in school and they need to wait in line, then they should be able to at least wait for their turn. At age 12 to 14, Children should be able to plan their own homework, they should be able to manage their own schedules, they should be able to now do independent chores and follow rules that are given to them. At age 15 to 17, they should then progress to managing their schoolwork, they should be able to set their own goals, they should be able to do more of planning and even avoiding risky behavior. So I've broken down a few executive functioning skills and some of the weaknesses or challenges that might present, examples of each, and strategies that could be useful. So for the working memory, we could find that someone has challenges holding information or even struggles with steps that are given to accomplish a task. So it might present as someone needing repeated instructions. And what could be helpful is them writing down the instructions or even keeping checklists for them to remember, like perhaps the tasks or the steps that they need to do, and even using visual cues. Flexibility could present as challenges with rigid thinking or struggling with change. So you might find that there's a lot of anxiety that shows up when change is required. And strategies here could involve teaching or building an individual's coping skills when it comes to changes or even with anxiety, or even coming up with action plans. Time management, on the other hand, could present as challenges with poor time awareness or a lot of procrastination, where we find that someone might do a lot of tasks last minute. And alarms and checklists or even to-do lists could really be helpful here. Emotional control could present as challenges managing emotions or regulating emotions. And an example would be when someone is given a task that is hard, they could get easily upset. So being able to teach children, adolescents, how to communicate effectively when they're experiencing these challenges, or to even just support them by co-regulating with them, especially for children, and even putting the emotions into words. So naming the emotion could be really helpful. Another one could be impulse control. So you find that someone tends to act without thinking. So you find that there's perhaps a lot of blurting or engaging in risky behavior. And coming up with behavior plans or teaching them strategies to take a pause and just think before acting could be helpful. Organization skill could also present as challenges with losing or misplacing items. An example could be someone forgetting their homework or losing their pencil, losing their homework books, losing their keys, IDs, So teaching them organizational skills like perhaps how to organize materials, having specific areas where certain things can be placed. Yeah, so maybe for keys, do you have somewhere where they can hang the keys so that it kind of becomes automatic for them that this is where I put my key. So when I need to trace it, this is where I come back to. Then we have goal-directed persistence, and it might present as challenges with finishing tasks. So you find that someone might give up very easily. Whenever they just face a challenge, they give up. So some strategies could be breaking these tasks into smaller, chewable bites, and then being able to reinforce effort. So perhaps using rewards and consequences here. Sustained attention, you could find that someone is easily distracted. So they're not maybe even able to, like for a child between 5 to 7 years, they're not able to pay attention for the 20 to 30 minutes. So in class, it might present as not being present or following what the teacher is saying. So strategies could be having written instructions for them, as well as just reinforcing some of these behaviors, like when they are able to sit and pay attention, how can you reinforce that so that they keep doing more of that? And then planning. So you could find that someone has struggles to plan their steps or plan their activities. An example would be they are not able to initiate or start projects or tasks. So some strategies could be using planners or even coming up with step-by-step guidance that are easy and clear to follow. So in other situations, we might find that there's an issue in an environment that causes an executive function impairment that can then mimic a disorder or present as a disorder. And some of these issues in the environment could include chronic stress, sleep deprivation, loneliness, and isolation, which then drain the prefrontal cortex capacity to be able to carry out this executive functioning. Yeah. So what happens when there's chronic stress in the environment? So we look at a state of underarousal, a state where the person is functioning at their optimum, as well as when there is chronic or toxic stress. So when the body is underaroused, the brain does not have enough neurotransmitters or neurochemicals such as dopamine, which is the feel-good hormone, or norepinephrine, which is key for attention or paying attention, to be able to run its day-to-day activities. So what happens here, we find that someone presents very sluggishly, they're having challenges shifting from one task to another, they're not able to pay attention as required. But when the body and the brain is working at its optimum, we find that there's a perfect balance of neurochemicals or these neurotransmitters. So in terms of working memory, it's at its optimum. In terms of cognitive flexibility, the brain is able to just be top notch in terms of just shifting from one task to another, shifting from one project to another, one thought to another, one experience to another. On the other hand, when we have chronic stress or toxic stress, the system goes into freeze. And some of the things that might cause this chronic stress include high levels of anxiety, a traumatic situation, or a physical or a mental threat. So what happens here is that the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC, freezes. And instead of the logic or the logical part of the brain coming into action to even analyze the threat that is in the environment, it freezes. So the brain defaults into survival mode and it acts on impulse. So it generally just wants to keep you safe at that point in time. So it will think later, but goes into action. So you could even find someone going into a lot of fight, flee, freeze response. Yeah. So what does research say about executive functioning? And we start off with a key research by Hackanson and her colleagues that focused on executive functioning capacities in mothers with substance use disorders. So they were able to find impairments in working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility, both during substance use and at the time where these mothers had stopped using substances. They also saw a link between executive functioning dysfunctions and higher parental stress. There was also a link between executive functioning capacities that were poor and a heightened psychological distress in mothers with substance use disorders. So remember, psychological distress could be depression, anxiety, stress, amongst others. Literature has also shown that there's a vicious cycle between psychological distress and executive functioning, in that the two are mutually reinforcing. The SCAR model, for example, by Franklin and his colleagues, argues that when psychological distress happens in a person's life, then it leaves a scar that predicts executive functioning decline even years later. We also have the vulnerability model by Zubin and Spring that argues that when one experiences or has executive functioning deficits, then it predicts or leaves them vulnerable to psychological distress. We also have the reciprocal model by Oath and Robbins that argues that this vicious cycle reinforces each other and occurs in a feedback loop. So where we have the working memory and inhibitory control working at an optimum, then that bridges or mediates stressful life events and clinical depression. So interventions that are based on mindfulness have been found to be very key in helping the repair the prefrontal cortex, or just helping it work at its optimum, which consequently helps executive functioning to increase positively. So skills such as decentering, which is helping people to just view thoughts as mental events and not facts, is very critical for freeing up the working memory. Also, prefrontal protection using mindfulness techniques is able to increase the window of tolerance, thereby preventing the hijacking of the prefrontal cortex during distressful times. Mindfulness also increases a person's interoceptive awareness. So this is the ability to be able to read or just be aware of their internal body signals. Mindfulness is also very effective in regulating a person's emotions, which would be very key in building the hot executive functioning skills. Other interventions that have been shown to be effective in executive functioning include cognitive training. So integrating cognitive training with other interventions. So perhaps applying a multimodal approach where you get to combine more than one approach. So combining mindfulness with a cognitive game, like this one known as SynchroLab that is driven by AI, has shown to produce faster results as compared to just using mindfulness alone or just using the cognitive games. Also, increasing the brain's processing speed could be helpful in reducing that cognitive noise that is a result of rumination. So you could improve the processing speed by practicing healthy living. So are you able to do your journaling? Are you able to do physical exercises, as well as just exercising healthy, or healthy sleep? Yeah, so ensuring that you get enough hours of sleep in your day, maintaining that sleep routine or sleep pattern that works. And most of these interventions work best when you're training the PFC to carry out this executive functioning when mimicking a real life situation. So not exposing someone to these trainings when they're not stressed, but perhaps giving them a job or a schedule that they can manage when they are stressed. So some key takeaways from the research that we've broken down is that there is help beyond medication, especially for disorders such as ADHD and depression that is resistant to treatment. Mindfulness has been found to be as effective or even perhaps better than using medication. And early intervention works best compared to late intervention. So just to wind up on everything that we've been talking about in terms of cognitive functioning, it is important to have a dual support system in terms of cognitive scaffolding. In that, when you're able to lower the environmental demands, then you gradually build an individual's internal neural capacity. So we have internal scaffolding as well as external scaffolding. So internally, we build capacity, and this could be done using techniques that I've alluded to earlier. So mindfulness, very critical in just strengthening those executive functioning, like self-monitoring or metacognition, or even emotional regulation, or even someone's ability to pay attention and just plan and even persist with a goal. Apart from that, mindfulness has also been shown to be very effective in terms of neurodivergence, so with ADHD. So doing more of mindfulness if that works for you, but as well as applying cognitive behavioral therapy skills that could be helpful. So this could be very effective in modifying those cognitive distortions or thought patterns that have been unproductive. And then whatever works, do more of that. Externally, how can you be able to lower that cognitive load so that someone is not operating in an environment that is very stimulating, so that you can also be able to lower internal stimulation? So doing some modifications in the environment, you know, we talked about using visual cues. We talked about decluttering, even just having a space in your room that is clear for someone to be able to just sit there and have some quiet time without having a lot of things that could be stimulating visually. And even lowering, the noise that sometimes comes with the devices. So are you able to have some time in your day where you're not watching something on your device, you're not listening to something on your device, but you're just perhaps just sitting with yourself in a quiet space that is not stimulating? Then analyzing tasks and breaking this into smaller steps that could work for you, but also just using checklists, using action plans, having launch pads where someone is perhaps having a difficulty with even accessing some of the places where they live, or even perhaps keeping their keys. Yeah, so how can you make the environment more productive and more safe for this individual to be able to reduce the cognitive load, but in return, to be able to optimize executive functioning? So we've come to the end of our presentation today, and I hope that this has been helpful or has just unlocked a curiosity for you. And I would appreciate your support in terms of subscribing, which is free, as well as just sharing the video, perhaps liking if it resonated with you, and turning on your post notification bell so that you get notified whenever I upload a new video. Until the next time, bye.